Did you know that in 2006, Britain made its final loan payment to the United States for World War II? It was a quiet end to a 60-year saga that saw the US systematically dismantle the British Empire and replace it as the world's dominant financial power. The story isn't just about a loan, it's about how America acquired an empire, not through conquest, but through accounting. The final payment was $83 million, the last piece of a $3.75 billion loan from 1946. But over the decades, Britain paid back $7.5 billion in total. That's just the loan. The real price was much, much higher through forced asset sales, leasing military bases, and dismantling its entire global trade system. Britain handed over wealth estimated today at nearly $500 billion. How did America pull this off with its closest ally? It's a masterclass in financial warfare. Let's rewind to 1939. Britain was the world's banker. The British pound was the global reserve currency, and its empire spanned the globe. But this empire had a weakness. It couldn't feed itself. It relied heavily on imports, a vulnerability America was ready to exploit. When war broke out, the US passed the Neutrality Acts. The policy was simple: cash and carry. If Britain wanted American weapons and supplies, it had to pay up front, in cash, and transport them on its own ships. This immediately forced Britain to start bleeding its wealth. First went the gold reserves, over $4 billion worth. Then came its vast overseas investments, another $12 billion. Liquidated to fund the war effort, Britain was selling off the family silver just to survive. By 1940, the cash was gone. Winston Churchill made a desperate plea to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that Britain was on the verge of financial collapse. This led to the famous Lend-Lease Act of 1941, often portrayed as a generous act of solidarity. The reality was far more complex. While it provided a lifeline, it came with devastating strings attached. The man pulling those strings was U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. He wasn't just interested in helping an ally. He saw an opportunity to permanently shift global power. Morgenthau demanded a complete and unprecedented audit of all of Britain's remaining global assets. He wanted to know exactly what Britain had left, so he could decide what the U.S. would take. This wasn't aid. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a rescue. He forced Britain into fire sales of its most valuable assets. A prime example was the American Viscose Corporation, a British-owned rayon manufacturer and a jewel of its overseas portfolio. It was worth over $120 million. Under pressure from Morgenthau, Britain was forced to sell it on the New York Stock Exchange for just $60 million, half its value. American investors made a fortune at Britain's expense, and it didn't stop there. As part of des destroys for basis deal, Britain received 50 obsolete World War I era American destroyers. In exchange, the U.S. got 99-year leases on strategic naval and air bases across the British Empire, from Newfoundland to the Caribbean and British Guiana. These weren't just temporary wartime arrangements. They were a permanent expansion of American military power into the heart of the British Empire. Acquired for a handful of outdated ships, Britain was literally trading pieces of its empire for the means to defend what was left of it. The Lend-Lease Agreement contained another hidden bomb: Article VII. This clause stipulated that after the war, Britain had to dismantle its system of Imperial Preference. For decades, this system had acted as a protective trade bloc for the British Empire, placing high tariffs on goods from outside nations, including the United States. It was the economic glue that held the empire together. Article VII demanded that Britain tear down these walls and embrace free trade, which really meant opening up its vast, protected markets to ruthlessly efficient American corporations. The U.S. wasn't just aiming to win the war. It was planning for the post-war economic world, a world it would dominate. Then, in August 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. And what did President Truman do? He immediately and abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. The aid pipeline was shut off overnight. There was no grace period, no transition. One day, supplies were flowing. The next, they were cut off. Britain, already bankrupted by 6 years of war, was plunged into a catastrophic economic crisis. The country was on the brink of starvation and financial ruin. Desperate, Britain sent its most brilliant economist, John Maynard Keynes, to Washington to beg for help. Keynes hoped to secure a $6 billion grant, a gift, not a loan, to help Britain rebuild. He argued that Britain had held the line against tyranny while America built its economic strength. But the Americans weren't in a charitable mood. They saw a final opportunity to cement their victory. Instead of a grant, they offered Keynes a loan, $3.75 billion, but with brutally harsh conditions. First, there was a 2% interest rate. More devastatingly, the U.S. demanded that Britain make the pound sterling fully convertible to the U.S. dollar within 1 year. This was a death blow. It meant that any country holding British pounds could immediately exchange them for U.S. dollars. Given America's industrial might and Britain's weakness, everyone rushed to dump their pounds. The result was a catastrophic run on Britain's currency. The $3.75 billion loan, which was meant to last 4 years, evaporated in a matter of weeks as countries converted their sterling holdings. After just 5 weeks, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. But the damage was done. Its financial credibility was shattered, and the U.S. dollar had definitively replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. This loan locked Britain into a cycle of debt for the next 60 years. By the time it was paid off in 2006, the total cost was $7.5 billion. The economic strain ensured Britain's decline as a global superpower, a decline symbolized by the 1947 Truman Doctrine, where a weakened Britain handed over its responsibilities in Greece and Turkey to the United States. The torch had officially been passed. But the story doesn't end with Britain. The ruthless playbook America used against its closest ally became the blueprint for its future economic policy. The institutions created at the U.S.-dominated Bretton Woods Conference, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank would use this exact model for decades to come. Think about the steps. Find a country in crisis. Offer a conditional loan it can't refuse. Force it to implement austerity. Privatize its state-owned assets for pennies on the dollar to foreign corporations. Enforce currency convertibility to drain its reserves and strip away its trade protections. This pattern has been repeated in over 80 countries across the developing world, creating a permanent system of debt and wealth transfer from sovereign nations to American and Western financial institutions. The irony is staggering. Britain, a victor in the war, was saddled with crippling debt for over half a century. Meanwhile, Germany, the defeated enemy, received billions in non-repayable aid through the Marshall Plan to rebuild its industry, turning it into an economic powerhouse and a market for American goods. The message was clear. It was better to be America's defeated enemy than its indebted friend. So, when we talk about the end of the British Empire, it wasn't just about independence movements and changing times. It was also a story of a deliberate, strategic, and devastatingly effective financial takedown executed by its greatest ally. America didn't need an army to conquer the British Empire. All it needed was a ledger. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more hidden histories. See you in the next video.